We're the first ones to shut up.
How dare you quieten my
Sorry. And so basically, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to play this. The movie itself was half an hour longer, but I've had to edit it down a bit because I didn't want everyone to fall asleep during a 2-hour presentation. So I thought 90 minutes everyone can handle. So yeah, exactly. Resting his eyes. And so I thought, you know what, why don't I just take the most important bits about this. Now, the way this actually happened was quite a spontaneous thing because William and I booked this date 6 months ago, something like that already. And we both said like, yeah, we need to do a talk because it's been a few years and, you know, he's been doing bits and I've been doing bits and this, that, and the other. And William and I talk a lot. We talk every month or every 3 weeks. We have long talks, and sometimes that's I've had talks of 3 hours with him, or we just talk about the case and just to go through stuff, what I've researched, what he knows about it, and so forth. So while I was doing that, him and I got to talk about the limo. And the limo is is an interesting subject, and because Malcolm has found a fair amount of Secret Service records, some people don't know about, and there was also a nice big file on the limo by Harry Livingston. So from a paper point of view, I already had something interesting. And then of course William mentioned the interview he'd done, and I didn't know anything about it, and he'd done it 4 years ago, and which is just before I basically met him and started talking to him. And then there was the idea of maybe, because he was going to do a book with him. That's the thing. I mean, it's been said during that interview that he was going to do a book with William together. But sadly, Joe died about 4 or 5 months after the interview as such. So the whole thing was canned. And when we started to talk about this stuff about a few weeks ago, we just said, well, why don't we just do a really nice big article? Because besides the film, William's got a few other bits, and I've got my bits, and combined together includes we can do a really interesting story on the limo by putting his research, that of Malcolm and that of Harry Livingston, together. And there's a lot on the glass. I've got about a dozen pictures on the front window glass with the crack in it and so forth, and all the reports that come with it. I've got a duty roster of people that were in the garage at that point, the basement in America. So I thought, well, there's plenty of stuff that actually could contribute to a really decent article as such. You know, it's not a book, but it's a good article that could be posted somewhere. So, William, my first question is, can you hear me?
Yeah.
William?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you.
William.
Can you just tell me briefly, or whatever you need, to talk about how you got in contact with Joe and how you've been in contact and how it led to that interview, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, apparently Joe had gotten a hold of a copy of my book, In the Eye of History. And he'd been talking to another researcher who knew me. And that researcher put me in contact with Joe. And he'd been working with another person trying to write this book, and it just wasn't working out. And so since he liked my book, he asked me to help him with it. And what was I going to do? Say no? No. So, yeah, this was a great opportunity. So I said, sure, I'll do it. So that's how it all began. Right.
So now you did the interview in 2017. What year was it when it all began then?
That same year. I should back up and tell you, some years before that, I had been hired by a company in Canada, Gala Films, because I was my book had been out, and they knew I had a relationship with Jim Seibert, and they wanted somebody that knew him because they wanted to interview him. So they brought me aboard after another researcher didn't work out, who was pretty prominent, and I took his place. And I they sent me a whole list of people to contact to try to talk them into being in this theatrical film that they were trying to make.
Right.
So Joe was one of those people that I contacted. I found him to be delightful, but I didn't pursue it beyond that. And then some years later, he happened to read my book, and then that connection was made. And so that's how it all began, really.
How frustrating is it to find out that, like all of a sudden, hold on, before I get to that, there's a question in between. The point of that interview that you did, what was this for? I mean, you were doing it for a book, but.
I was, but I don't know how you managed to talk me into these things. I had never intended for that film really to be seen. Yes. It was for my own documentation. Joe was 89 at the time, I believe, 88 or 89. And I thought, well, I better get something on film just in case, Joe doesn't make it through the process.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky I did, because not too long after that interview was done, he passed. The point was just to get some documentation. We had many talks over the phone, but I needed to make the human connection with Joe. I needed to meet with him, be in a room with him, talk to him, look at him as a person. I wanted to be comfortable with him. And most of all, I wanted him to be comfortable with me. And that's just how I work. I need to be in a room with the person I'm interviewing. And hopefully I can have some long, sustained time with them so that they can get comfortable, and we can have a dialogue and maybe a bit of a relationship. So unfortunately, that was the only face-to-face meeting I ever had, but I'm lucky that I recorded it for posterity, because we have it now.
And for the better, because some of the quotes are excellent from him, and give you a really good insight as well. I found that anyway, when I read some of the HSCA reports of some of the Secret Service agents, they were really candid and really straightforward in their observations about when they arrived at Parkland Hospital and so forth. So if they do talk in good detail, I've got to say. So that was a thing. Now, of course, how does this work out? So then you've done the interview, and he passes away very sadly. And then what? It just gets boxed and just put on a shelf?
Shelved. He kept saying to me, I was working on a book, another book at the time, and I was trying to juggle both of them. And he would say to me, now, William, you're working on this other book isn't going to interfere with what we're doing. I said, oh no, Joe, it's not. I can do both of them. And unfortunately, I would talking to his girlfriend later, he would tell me things, and then I would write a piece, and I would call him up, and I said, listen to what I write, and I would take this event that he had told me about, and I would read it to him that I had written, and he would go, oh, that's beautiful, William. That's beautiful. That's just the way it was. And I was really happy that he was happy, and it would just send him through the moon, because he felt he wasn't getting anywhere working with this other person. So he felt that he really had found somebody that could get this story out. And in later years, after he had passed, I had talked to his girlfriend, who was about 20 years younger than he was, by the way.
Oh, wow.
He had a thing for the women, let me tell you. And she said, he would come off of the phone from talking to you, and he would just be over the moon. he was so happy. And, you know, the one regret I'm going to take to my grave is the fact that I didn't get the book done for him. It hurts me today to say that watching that piece of film, it always hurts when I watch it because it's, you know, I'm very aware that I fell short and he didn't get to see his dream of telling his own story. And he had some stories, and I'll tell you right up front, he did not appreciate the way that he was portrayed in the detail by what's the guy's name?
Gerald Blaine?
Gerald Blaine. He was not happy with him or Clint Hill. And he
Fuck Gerald Blaine. Go on. Yeah, sorry, dude.
absolutely. And he wanted to set the record straight. The really sad part is that he still had connections to some of the Secret Service agents. Now, some of them were really ticked at him because, you know, he was quoted in that book, The Dark Side of Camelot by Seymour Hersh. And a lot of the agents turned against him. There were threats against him. I can't remember which agent it was. Maybe it was him, but I can't remember. One of them threatened to punch him in the nose for talking about events. I talked to all of those agents, and all of them had gotten a short shift after they had talked to Seymour Hersh because they broke the code of silence. And if you break the code of silence in the Secret Service, you're doomed, you know? So
Yeah.
I feel so very fortunate, so very lucky to have had that experience with him. I've had that experience. I mean, how many of you would love to sit in a room with a former Secret Service agent on John F. Kennedy's detail and have 2 hours with him and be able to ask him any damn thing you wanted? That was the position I was in. I'm so grateful for that.
Yeah, I think it's good that you came up with a bit where you basically accused them of being a lackluster bunch of wankers, basically, for the fact that they were so slow in reacting. So I thought that was really good at pointing that out.
Well,
but I also thought his reply was pretty good when he compared it to, say, athletes and so forth. And I'd say, yeah, there are some mitigating circumstances, but at the same time, they were all on the piss the night before. So, you know, getting all drunk and getting to bed late, etc., which is always conveniently swept underneath the carpet. Who was involved and who was actually the last one to join the bunch and basically to leave the cellar as such.
right.
But, you know, you wouldn't have done this by yourself, like, because you're so focused on the medical part of the assassination itself. So had he not called or contacted you, you would have never spoken to him in the first place, would you?
Well, remember, I did speak to him some years before.
Oh yeah, sorry. My bad.
Vince Palomara has been well known for covering the Secret Service, and I've done some work with him in the past. And he has told me personally that he feels the real answers are in the medical evidence. And I feel the same way. That's why I went in that direction. I was working with someone, Mark Sobel, who is a director here, and done some movies and some TV stuff. And I had happened to do some work for him on something he was working on, Jacqueline Kennedy, that he found in the archives. And my publisher at the time put me together with him. And at some point, I wanted to do something on the Secret Service. And so I sent Mark a note and I said, you know, I don't have any credentials, you know, as far as making movies, and I've got to get something special to make these Secret Service agent guys want to talk to me. Would you mind if I basically used your credentials and had a way in? And he emailed me back and said, let's do it for real. So I had planned to do a book on the Secret Service, but Mark Sobel is an interesting fellow. He at one point said, we found where these guys had their, every year they get together in a different part of the United States and they have a big convention. And Mark said, look, what we do is we find out where these guys are, and we take our cameras and we go in there. We don't ask for permits. We don't do anything. We show up. We show up where they are, and we go right into that room where they are. And I've got my camera. And he said, I'll be filming you the whole way. And when you get into that room and I'm right behind you and I've got that camera on you, he said, we will just start asking them questions. And he said, man, if they pull their guns on you, it'll be terrific. We'll get it all on film, which cooled my enthusiasm just a little. And so we set this whole thing up to do it, but somehow we got distracted. I couldn't get any of these guys really to talk to me. People that I tried to get a hold of, they'd had this other thing with Palomar, and they weren't about to really open up to me. So that kind of went by the wayside, but I had always had in the back of my head while I was doing my first book, In the Eye of History, about Bobby, because I was told, once you get into the thing about John Kennedy, you're going to fall in love with Bobby, which is exactly what I did. Although I was already in love with Bobby Kennedy way before I got into research, the real heavy research on his brother.
Yeah.
So I always wanted to do something about that. And so when I met Mark face to face at a conference and we couldn't bring the Secret Service thing together, I said, I'm going to start doing some research and doing some research on Bobby Kennedy, hopefully to do a book. Would you like to come along with me and film some of these interviews? So it switched from doing something about the Secret Service to RFK, and I've been into that now for some 15 years.
Wow.
William,
How's that going, by the way? Let's talk a little bit about RFK. I just want a little bit, just a summarization. 15 years. How would you compare as their own separate situation, like the medical evidence from JFK compared to RFK? Now, we only have one. It was just only Dr. Noguchi whose paperwork was presented, or am I wrong here, compared to, say, the 3 pathologists in Bethesda?
Yeah, pretty much. He was a linchpin. Noguchi was a linchpin. I did try to get a hold of Dr. Noguchi because I did a book on Marilyn Monroe that hasn't been published yet, and he was, of course, the coroner for that one as well. And so I've tried many times to contact Dr. Noguchi. I did get a hold of his wife one time, calling his home, but he was out working at his old place of employment, which was interesting because at that point he was retired. There are lots of things in the RFK situation, the autopsy. I really don't want to get too far into RFK.
No, I just want to talk to generic, because otherwise we're sitting here for another 6 hours, and that's not the intention.
Oh, I could talk more than 6 hours, let me tell you. It's been a really interesting time for me. There's been a big thing about Sirhan passing the first test of parole, and I don't even know if I want to talk about this.
Okay, well, let's leave it then.
All right. Well, it's about the lawyer that finally got him past the parole, and I had a big hand in that, and I still don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, sometimes these things take time, regarding I'll ask one more question. You know what? I'm not going to ask anything anymore. What the listeners should know is that William and I are working on, we're going to do another interview, but we're going to go really deep into the autopsy and the medical stuff, probably next year, over 1 or 2 episodes, because there's a lot to talk about with regarding to that. And I just wanted to mostly chat about this movie, how it got together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Tony if he wants to talk, to let some of the people ask questions. You can ask him any question you want. It doesn't have to be just about the Secret Service or whatsoever.
Yeah.
So as long as he's
Fire
willing.
away.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what, Tony, you can take over.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks a lot, Bart. And thanks a lot for that. And William, forgive me. I meant to welcome you. I didn't know you were here. Thank you so much for joining us. Gary, I know that you had a question that you want to ask. I want to bring you in.
Yeah, William, Joe asked how you knew about the Secret Service records being withdrawn by the Secret Service. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I can't.
Okay. I was in the National Archives in 2003, and I asked for the files on the conservation tour, which were the files that were destroyed. And when they brought them to me, my wife reached for the first of the 2 or 3 boxes that they brought out, and they just about flipped off the cart because they were empty. So I got up and opened them, and the 2 boxes for the conservation tour from September 24th until about September 28th, I think it was a 10-city, 5 or 6 day tour. There was one piece of paper in each box, and it said, "Withdrawn for national security reasons." And when I talked to Tunheim about it, he said, "Oh, that's interesting. You know, when I asked them for the files, they said, oh, we destroyed those 2 weeks ago." And that was 95, like you told Joe. So there was something about that tour. My theory, of course, is that it was the time that an assassination was to take place at the end of September. But when you see things like that, withdrawn for national security reasons, and I said to the curator, I said, "So how do I get these?" "Well, just request them." "Yeah, right."
For you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never did.
I've got to interject real quick. And I told William this. Malcolm told me this week. In 1967, the Secret Service appointed someone, I forgot his name, who went culling through the records already back then. So the 95 is not the first destruction or culling. In 1967, they did something as well.
Sure. Right. It's just that in 95, they culled the ones, there were the 63 records had still been there in 95. And they got rid of them in 95. So they started in 67, I assume, but then it continued. When the heat was on from the ARRB in Tunheim, then they knew the jig was up. They better get rid of those too, is the assumption, I guess.
I think you're right. What's really interesting is they had been told to preserve those records. They knew to preserve those records, and they got rid of them anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Even though they were ordered to keep them. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
so that's what makes it interesting, is that,
yeah,
you know, in the face of a direct order, they disobeyed it. So I always come back to this. If Oswald killed Kennedy, if it's a cut and dried case, why do we have so many of these, for lack of a better word, anomalies where they burn papers they know they shouldn't burn? If it's just so cut and dried and straight, why all the crap around it? You know, it doesn't make sense. You know, it's
only to obfuscate.
That's it.
Only to hide things and obfuscate. I mean, so I talked to Malcolm on video about every 2 or 3 weeks for the last 2-3 months. I've been doing that. I just did my 5th story, and every time the debate goes about documents being destroyed, documents missing, his own collection, which shows that there's between 30 and 40% of material is just absolutely no trace of online whatsoever. So Malcolm's archive is going to have 30 to 40% of material that you can't get at Merryfair or at the National Archive and so forth, because they just haven't been released. I mean, they've been released in full, but they're not published online as such. So yeah, that's quite an interesting fact. But it's just quite interesting by itself, the whole thing with all the documentation that's been destroyed. And we're talking everyone, every agency, every commission, you know, it doesn't matter. There's not one that's exempt from these shenanigans. And, you know, they have processes in place where they say, well, after 25 years, we destroy the records. And, you know, and they're perfectly legit to do so, because there's never been some kind of directive that says anything on JFK is to be kept until further notification as such, which of course seems a reasonable thing, but we're talking about half a dozen law enforcement related agencies as such, you know, customs, FBI, Secret Service, and so forth. Agency, of course, and they all have their own thing, but yet they are also making many documents disappear. And when I listen to Malcolm, it's just this mountains of stuff that just completely disappeared. You know, it's ridiculous. And
You know,
yeah,
I just want to take a moment to, you know, say what an amazing person Malcolm Blunt is. I mean, my God, if he didn't exist, you'd have to invent him. You know, it's
we'd all be fucked. We'd all be
just
fucked.
amazing work by this one man who has taken all this time and effort to get all these documents.
Yeah,
You know,
it's unbelievable. Anyone
he's one
who
of the
lives,
true unsung heroes in this thing.
yeah, definitely, without a shadow of a doubt. Anyone who lives next to the archives for 6 months and goes there 5 days a week, 5 days a week, just walk in there and just scan.
It's incredible.
And you know what? And he tells me, and he goes, "Oh, there's 800 boxes of FBI material. 800 boxes. You know, it's just an absolute enormous amount." And I said, "Well, how far did you get?" "Yeah, about halfway." I'm thinking, and you've been there all that time. You know, it just shows you that there's a lot of stuff. But slowly he's been giving me pointers as to where to go and where to look for things, and get finding aids and other directories that will help you with your search as such. Things that aren't really known unless you are in it, basically. So, and Malcolm is an absolutely superb human being who has done an absolute stellar job. And think about it, everyone uses their material, whether they acknowledge it or not. That's another story. But overall, practically every writer that writes on JFK has been receiving documents from him as such.
Right. I'm sure that's true. Anything else?
Johnny, you got a question?
Lenovo E10, yeah. Mr. Sale Sharks, go ahead. Oh, I can barely hear you.
Yeah, very hard.
It's hard to hear you.
I'm on my tablet, which might, let me think, hang on.
You got, it sounds like a,
What's it like now?
Your mic is just, it's like you got it in your pants or something like that. That's how it sounds. Really.
the old tin, tin from the tin string.
Oh dear. My question, if anybody can hear it.
Go ahead. I can hear you. Go ahead.
Is Paul O'Connor has no brain inside JFK skull, and yet there's an opposite thing from oh God, what's his name?
Jim Jenkins?
Yeah, from Jim Jenkins of them removing the brain, blah blah, and then weighing it and putting it in the gauze, what have you. David Lifton, who just put something on the education forum saying about this, that when he interviewed James Jenkins back in 1980-ish, that he didn't come out with all this information that he gave to you. Did you ever ask him about that?
Did I ask who?
Jim Jenkins, why there was more detail that he gave to you that he sort of didn't divulge to Lifton?
I did discuss that, and I discussed it at length with Jim over the years. He told me some stories. I'm wondering if I should, I'm always reluctant to talk about, I'm always reluctant to talk about conversations I've had unless I've been given permission. Let me just say that Mr. Jenkins was, he told me about the first meeting that he had with David Lifton. And he said that, well, hell, it's just between all of us, right? It'll never get out. Jim said that he did talk to David over the phone. He came to his house, and he said back in those days, it was still, in the 70s. And he showed up with the camera crew, basically, and was sitting in his living room and was there for several hours. Really uncomfortable. He didn't know David from Adam. And so he said he tried to get his wife to kind of be in another place. He didn't even want her around it because he was so nervous about the whole thing. And so he was pretty uncomfortable with David at that point. You'll notice I knew Jim over a 20-year period before we wrote a book together. So I don't know how much real contact he had with David Lifton, but I'll just say that he was uncomfortable. As the years passed and I talked him into, I banged on him all the time. Jim, you should do something for history. This is important. You're important to history. If you don't tell your story, somebody else is going to tell it. And I just kept doing that every once in a while. And one morning, I didn't take in mind that I've had a relationship with him now, I almost a quarter of a century. But at that point, it was 20 years. And he called me up and said, William, I've been talking to my wife, and she says, that I really should leave something for history. And I've decided to do that. Will you help me? And, of course, I'm like, well, of course I'll help you, So, and keep in mind, Jim is from the South, and my father was from the South, Arkansas. They're not the kind of people that just talk about their lives and talk about what's going on. They're pretty private individuals. Jim is one of the most private people that I've ever had to deal with. And so when we were doing the book and I would ask him certain questions, he would just, I don't want to talk about it. It wasn't anything big. It wasn't even about the Kennedy assassination. It was like, well, what was your life like growing up? How did you live? What was your relationship to, your dad? How did you grow up? How did you find yourself in these circumstances? And it's like little things like being on on the base when he first got into the military. It was like he didn't want me to talk about how he used to live and things like that. It was, even those things were way too personal about him. Now that's just a little background. So now I'll get back to your question about the brain. When I first encountered Jim face to face, it was in Louisiana. I had finally, through some conversations, worked, because I'd heard that he was really reclusive, and I hadn't read much about Jim except what was in David Lifton's Best Evidence and Harrison Livingstone's High Treason. So that's all I basically knew about him. And the fact that he was even talking to me surprised me. So through these conversations, I finally worked up the nerve, after I'd interviewed everybody else just about for my first book. I worked up the nerve to say, Jim, if you let me come out there, I could get a really good price on a ticket. And I heard him chuckle and he said, "You can, huh?" So he gave me permission to come and see him. And I don't know if you've read In the Eye of History, but that story about how I met him and that first meeting is all in the book. And I wrote about that, just how it took place. Now, I'm sitting across from Jim. Say you're sitting across the table from me, a small table, and I've got the camera on him, and I'm really excited to be here. And he starts talking about Kennedy's brain. Now, I'm very well aware that Paul O'Connor has said Kennedy had basically no brain in his cranium, that there was maybe a macerated half a handful of brain pieces in the brain, in the skull, but no brain. And then Jim says to me, standing there at the table, and he says, "Hume's made a statement." Now, I'm sitting there in this room, and I'm sitting there with this guy, and I'm very close to him, and it was his body language and it was his tone of voice. And he says, "Hume's made a statement," and what I think he said was, "Okay, that damn thing fell out in my hand," talking about the brain. Right. Said that damn thing fell out in my hand. And I said, and I'm trying to maintain my composure. And I said, "Well, what does that mean to you, Jim?" And he says, "What I think that means is that the brain was removed and replaced." So I'm trying to act like, I hear this crap every week. This is no big deal. I want to fall on the floor because I'm sitting here across from this guy, sitting at this table. I finally, after all this time, got him where I want him. And he says, "I think the brain was removed and replaced." So yeah, I'm well aware that Paul O'Connor says there was no brain. Of course, Jim told me that he said, "I was given a brain to infuse that night." And he said the thing was that I had to fight to get the needles into the arteries coming off of the brain, because he said the ends of the arteries looked like they were constricted. He said, which meant that it looked like the brain had been out of the head for a while. Yeah. So he said, "I'm trying to get these needles." They had a way of infusing brains at that point at Bethesda. They would take formalin solution and they would infuse the brain with the formalin solution. And then they would take the brain and they would put the brain in what they called a brain bucket, which was basically a stainless steel bucket filled with formalin. And they would have a gauze sling over the top of the bucket. And you would place the brain in the sling, in the bucket, and then the brain would soak. And then when they needed it, they would take the brain out, and the brain would be hardened at that point so that you could slice the brain up to see pathways or whatever you needed to see in the brain. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to go back to Cybernet O'Neill. In Frank O'Neill's testimony in 1997, he was asked, I think, by Jeremy Gunn about the brain, and they hand him a picture that is purportedly of President Kennedy's brain. So they give him this picture, and he says, well, all right. He says, if you're telling me that this is President Kennedy's brain, then it is. But I can't swear on a stack of Bibles that this is what I saw. And he says, well, he says, it appears to be different. Gunn says, in what way does it appear to be different? Well, it appears to be too much. It appears to be too much. When I talked to Seibert, and in later conversations with O'Neill, I kept hammering at one point. I had come so far in these phone conversations with him. I kept hammering about the brain, and he says, brain, you keep saying brain. He said there wasn't a brain. He said there was a section of brain. And he was really ticked at me because I kept pushing on this. He said, brain, you keep saying brain. It wasn't a brain, it was a section of brain. Or words to that effect. And then Seibert I told Seibert, that, well, I talked to your partner and he said, that there wasn't much brain, and he chuckled. He laughed. He says, I heard him chuckle over the phone. And then later, when I was interviewing Seibert in his home, he said, I asked him about it again, and he said, well, I was right up there. And he said, I'm hazy on that, but he said, you could look right into the cranium. So I hope I'm not boring you guys with this, and I know
No, not at all.
There's a whole story about how I got inside Jim Seibert's home. Okay, I go through all these events to get to Jim Seibert, and he finally relents and he says I can come. So I fly to Florida as soon as possible, and he picks me and Deborah Conway up in his car because we have to go find the place to pick up our rental car. So he has agreed to take us there. Now I get into the car in the back seat, and I'm sitting directly behind Jim Seibert, and his little wife Esther is sitting beside him, and Deborah's sitting next to me in the back. And I say something along the lines of, Mr. Seibert, I'm so glad that we could be here and that I can meet you because you know so many things and you've had your hands on the body of the president. And his little wife, and I'm thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to ask this man about Kennedy's brain and about O'Connor? His little wife turns around to me and she says, well, his brains were all blown out of his head. Well, I said, well, that was one of the questions I was going to ask. Well, you know what happened? Jim went home after the autopsy, and he goes to his wife. He goes, hey, S. He called her S, not Esther. He says, hey, S, guess what? I was at Kennedy's autopsy, and his brains were blown out of his head. This is how you pick up these pieces of information, that if you can stay with it long enough, if you can get yourself inside to talk to these people and be a person, have them be comfortable, get comfortable, let them know that you're a person and you're really interested in this. You can get these little things that fill in this mosaic of the Kennedy assassination. And that's what I was trying to do. And I had some real luck. So to answer your question about how do you balance this thing of brain and no brain? Well, we've basically got Paul O'Connor, who says there was no brain to be removed. It was my job that night to make the craniotomy and take the brain out of the head, but there was no brain to be removed. You've got Jim Seibert, who said, I'm hazy on that, but you could go directly into the cranium. And then you have the statement from Esther, his wife, who said, well, who wasn't there, but is married to the man that was in the autopsy room and saw Kennedy's skull and said his brains are all blown out of his head. And then you've got Frank O'Neill, who in his testimony before the Records Review Board is handed this picture of a brain. and this is President Kennedy's brain, and he says, well, I can't swear on a stack of Bibles, but this is what I saw. It appears to be too much. So you've got all of that, and then you've got Jim saying, I was handed a brain to infuse that night. And the brain, the arteries on the brain coming down from the brain looked like they had been constricted, which told me that the brain was out of the head for some time. So I think what we're looking at, and I know the conclusion that Jim has reached, is that the brain that he looked at and examined was not of President Kennedy's brain. I believe Paul O'Connor when he says there was no brain within the cranium. I believe most of it was blown out or taken out between Parkland and Bethesda, whatever was left, and replaced with another one. I hope that's a very long-winded answer to the question.
Can I ask, what would
No.
be the point to do that to the brain?
Well, what would be the point if you have the
From a
real-
medical point of view? So I'm talking like, so if they take the brain out, blah, 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 what would the point be?
well,
For them
if-
to obfuscate and all that? Why?
if you,
What's
if
the
you-
reason?
Lauren, are you gonna
Yeah.
let me? See, this is what happens in the conversations with Mr. Bart here. If you have the real brain of Kennedy, and if there's anything left, and there was, according to the Parkland doctors, that the brain was damaged, some of it was gone, but there was also the cerebellum that was said to have been swinging in the breeze by one of the doctors. If you have the original brain, then you can take that brain, soak it in formalin, section it later, see the pathway of the bullet and the direction of which way the bullet came, because you can tell from that, because the brain is kind of gelatinous, and you can, when it's hardened, you can look at all that and go, oh, the bullet came this way or that way or this way.
Let me ask the question.
Okay.
So everybody assumes that it has been hidden because to determine the direction of the shots and so forth. Now let's just swipe that off the table for a second.
Okay.
Could there be another reason for them to remove the brain?
Bullet fragments.
Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, all of that. Bullet fragments, directions of where the bullets came. All true.
I'll let you off on this one, but yeah, okay.
That's very generous of you.
Guys, can I just bring Johnny Cairns in here, because I know he's got a couple of questions that he wants to raise up. Johnny, can you hear us okay?
Oh, how you doing?
Yeah, come on in, Johnny.
Oh yeah, how you doing?
Hey, Johnny, how are you?
I'm okay, thanks. I'm okay. Thanks for being here. Just want to say your book's one of the best that's ever been published on the case.
Thank you.
For the medical evidence, etc. And I think the beauty of your book is that you just let people tell their stories. You know what I mean? There's no theories. It's just so yeah, it's one of my favorite books on the case. So I've got a couple of questions that I've been writing here on my phone while you were talking.
Can you speak up a little? I'm having a really hard time hearing you.
Yeah, can you hear me a bit better now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Close to the mic.
Yeah, it's probably the mic.
Oh, yeah.
So I've written a few questions that I wanted to ask you on my phone here. And the first one was about Pitzer. Apparently, he took a video of the autopsy that night. Do you think he did? And if so, do you think it still exists? The second question I want to ask you is, why do you think men like Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins were not called to testify before the Warren Commission?
Well, on the question of Pitzer, if you go back through the document, nobody's ever been able to find that film. Now, it's really interesting because in Hume's testimony before the Records Review Board, he said that there was a closed camera system in the morgue. But I've talked to other people that said that there was no camera system in the morgue. There's a whole thing about Pitzer's suicide, if it was suicide, if it wasn't suicide. The only reason I believe that there was film is because of Dennis David's story. Dennis David, I knew for years. You have to understand that when I started doing this, I intended to try to keep up these relationships with these guys, and there was a reason for that. I needed to test their veracity, so to speak. You could say a hard-bitten journalist wouldn't get so close to these guys. Well, I'm not a hard-bitten journalist. I'm a guy that's interested in the Kennedy case. And so for me, what I wanted to do was get as close to these guys on a personal level as I could get. And therefore, I could test for myself whether these guys were honest or they weren't being honest. And I can tell you that Dennis David is one of the most honest people I've ever met. And if he tells me that there was film, then I don't know if Pitzer took it, but I can tell you if he said it happened, I believe it happened. I don't know that he didn't commit suicide. There's a whole thing about his hand being mangled, though that was all crap. And how do I know that? Because I interviewed Pitzer's son, and there was a reason behind the story of the mangled hand that I won't go into here, but none of that was true. Whether he committed suicide, there's a lot of people that believe that he was killed. I'm depending on what time in the morning I get up, I toss it back and forth in my head. I still don't know, but I tend to believe that he probably wasn't. He probably did commit suicide. He had a trouble. If you go back and you read some of the statements from witnesses that knew him and saw things, he was a troubled guy, had trouble with his children. His relationship with his wife wasn't good. Apparently, one of his friends had died. A couple of his friends had died, and he said, "I wonder who the third will be." There's things like that. If I try not to speculate about things, because if I can't prove it, I don't want to set the rumor mill going. I don't want to make speculation and go, well, this absolutely happened. I know that it happened. No, I have to test the bridge. If I can prove something to you and it's concrete, I'll tell you it's concrete. And if I think that it's not concrete, I'm not going to tell you that I believe it. I just won't. It's a disrespect of history.
Yeah.
To interject my own thoughts, and I, the reason I started doing this research and doing my own books was invariably in everybody's book on this assassination, you will come to a chapter that says what really happened. And then the writer, the author, will give you his interpretation of what really happened, whether he knows it or not. I won't do that. And that's why I've done radio programs, really important radio programs that could have gotten me a lot of air and sold a lot of books. And because the radio person wanted to lead me in a specific direction and get me to agree with whatever his theory was, I would remain silent. And then he would look at me and say, well, surely you have an opinion. And I wouldn't go where they want me to go. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for myself to understand it as much as I can understand it. And then if I can pass it on to you, then I will. History is important to me. Whatever truth can be had in history, I want to make sure that it is the truth. I don't want to give you speculation. I don't want to give you bullshit. I don't want to give you my opinion. I try to keep it out of my filter as much as possible and just give you what the information is. What was your second question, Johnny? I'm sorry.
The second question was, why do you think men like O'Connor and Jim Jenkins and Dennis David were not called to testify before the commission?
Oh, Lord. Can you imagine if they got before the commission and they said, well, sir, when I saw President Kennedy's body, he didn't have a brain in his head, sir.
Yeah.
what the hell? And then they would have Jim Jenkins that said, well, I was handed a brain and it was put in a bucket, but sir, there's a problem. I had trouble getting the needles into the carotid arteries. It looked like the brain had been out of the head for a while. And to tell you the truth, sir, I believe the brain was removed and then replaced with another brain. What the hell do you think they would have done with that?
Oh, yeah.
There would have been no Warren report. They would have had to come up with another reason, you know. Well, we can't issue a report right now, and we'll get it to you when we can. They would have blown that whole thing out of the water. Even in years later, when Doug Horn at the Records Review Board wanted to interview Dennis David and Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins, or Jim Jenkins and Paul O'Connor, he was told, you will not interview them. So my information was the newest out there and the most complete. And so I don't know how many of you have read Doug Horn's 5-volume set, but he lifted interviews from Paul O'Connor and Jim right out of my book to use in his set, which is fine with me because I wrote that stuff to be out there so that people can have it and study it and read it. So I was fine with that. And because he did that at the point where he wasn't giving interviews, when I wanted to interview him for a new edition of my first book, he gave me a really lengthy interview for my book, and I was really grateful for that.
But can you imagine what this would have meant if Oswald had been murdered? I mean, you'd have men testifying, maybe like O'Connor at his trial, and maybe that's one of the, well, we know that Oswald was murdered to stop a trial, but can you imagine this all coming out in the public domain in 1964, that there was no brain, etc.?
Well, no, and they couldn't either. And that's why, you know, the stuff was buried for 50 years.
Yeah.
No, there's no way in hell that could have been allowed to come to the fore.
I've got one last question, if you bear with me. A lot of people I've spoke to recently have claimed that the assassination didn't take place in 6 seconds, but rather it was between 8 and 9 seconds, maybe even 10 seconds. Okay. If the assassination was, let's say, 9 seconds long, does it not make the Secret Service's inaction even more inexplicable? Because they had longer to react?
Well, you know, that's speculation on my part, but I'd have to say yes. But, you know, try as I might, you know, I used to revere Clint Hill. I first saw that interview that he gave to 60 Minutes, you know, I think it was in 75. And, you know, and he's at the end, he's, you know, crying and his voice is shaking. I always respected him. And then I had a couple of conversations with him that I still respected him, but in later years, I found that he was selling pictures of himself on the back of the limousine after the assassination for $200 a pop. And then I was doing a film shoot that was going to take place in Chicago in, I think it was 2015. And we got a hold of Mr. Hill to ask him to be part of the film. And he, we were willing to, huh?
I said, da da da, here we go. Here, out he comes.
We were willing to pay his expenses and fly him out and put him up. And Mr. Hill said that he would do it for expenses, all expenses paid, and $10,000. So, you know, here this guy is, as quickly as he acted, the president still died. He's been going around, you know, forever going, you know, I tried as best I could to save the president. I don't care what kind of awards I get. And then now he is going around wanting, if he appears anywhere, he wants thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. But what I find most egregious is that he is selling pictures of himself for $200 a pop. It might be 300 or 400 now. And it just sickens me. So it's in the little details that you can tell a lot about somebody. And this tells me a lot about Clint Hill. And I know if I had the chance again and I was facing Mr. Hill, you can bet that I would not take it easy on him. That I'd grill that fucker like a piece of fish.
Good on you. I'd love to see it. I'll tell you. Her and also address this whole Lisa McCubbin part as well. My God, what a disgrace that is. He is two-timing his wife with her. I mean, now that he's together, but
yeah, it's in the details that tell you about a person, isn't it? So
how many books they done together? 3 or 4, something like that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. And I said to him in our conversation, I said, Mr. Hill, trying to ingratiate myself, I am shameless. I will do whatever I have to do to get wherever I need to be with a witness. If I need to, I will fulfill whatever if I do this for you and you let me come out there, I'll do it, whatever that is. And I said, if you ever want to write a book, I can get you a publisher. He said, well, I thought about that. And then he said, I took a vote against myself and I decided not to. Well, and then he wrote right after that, he wrote the foreword to Lisa McCubbin's book. And I heard that they sold several 100,000 copies of that book. And
really?
Yeah. And he made a few bucks off of that. So then he realized that he could make some money. And then I don't know what charms Ms. McCubbin had for him, but the next thing I know, it's rumored that they're living together and possibly married, and he wasn't yet divorced from his wife. So, so apparently Mr. Hill, whether it's low or whether it's high, has his price.
Well, how immoral is that? You're making money off the fact that you fail to protect the president.
Well, I'll do you one better. I'll do you one better, Johnny. I saw a picture of Olgins of Clint Hill with his legs sticking out on top of the limo, and then I saw his signature on it, and then I saw Jim Lavelle's signature right next to it, and I was like, how the fuck can that be? He's not even involved in this shit, and they were both signing the same picture.
It doesn't surprise me.
Okay.
Will you?
Just jump in here and just Gary, before you jump in, I want to clarify something. Just for the sake of the membership, we only paid William $10,000 for this interview. Okay, we did not pay expenses.
And cheap at twice the price, I might add.
I drew the line with that. Okay. Sorry, Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, William, Joe said in your interview that Clint Hill almost had a nervous breakdown. John and I are privy to what happened to Hill when he went back to his home in Grand Forks, North Dakota, to live with his stepsister and brother-in-law while he underwent therapy. And I had always been under the assumption that that is an indication that he was terribly guilty about not having done his job. But, as you put the pieces of the puzzle together with the things you're saying, you wonder, what was he actually guilty about? He knew something that was not about his own failure, but possibly about something that he knew about the conspiracy. The complicity of the Secret Service. Who knows?
Speculation. I can just tell you from what I've seen, I'll just say that I am extremely disappointed in Mr. Hill. I don't like anybody that would be involved in that. You lose the life of the president, and now, all these years later, since you know you can make money from it, you make,
Yeah.
just sickens me. It really
Well,
does.
and I ran into him at the book depository on the 50th. And I ended up talking to Jerry Blaine's wife as Hill and Blaine were in a side room in the book depository doing an interview with some local station. And I said, maybe this is common knowledge, but I said to her, so your husband was in the motorcade? And she says, oh no, he was asleep in Fort Worth. And here's Jerry Blaine running interference for Hill and other agents, and he wasn't even there.
Doesn't that tell you something?
Yeah.
I think it does.
Yep.
Blaine
It's,
was only a Secret Service agent for about 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, I don't know.
He wasn't that long in there, but he puts himself forward as the guy, the protector of the whole posse, blah blah blah. But he's only been a service agent for 5 years compared to all the others who basically spent half their lifetime doing it.
I talked to, let me see if I can conjure his name. It was the guy, Tim McIntyre, who was on the back of the follow-up car, or on the side. I think he was on the side. In a conversation with him when he was one of the people that I talked to for Gala Films, and he did consent, and they went out and they filmed him, and he gave him the whole story. He was a pretty bitter guy. He said, people think we were making all this money, and he said we weren't making anything. And at one point he said to me, I thought the Kennedys were a bunch of users and I didn't want anything to do with them. And I just, when I heard that, it was just, here's this guy that's supposed to be protecting the president. And he says, I thought the Kennedys were a bunch of users and I didn't want anything to do with them. A lot of these guys had lost respect for Kennedy, or maybe they didn't have any to begin with. When Kennedy did a lot of womanizing. That's just how it was. And I've had more than, but let me tell you what Joe Paolella said in a conversation. I don't even remember. He didn't like to talk about this. He said, William, I don't want to talk about Kennedy.
Yeah, it says in the movie.
I don't want to talk about that. But in other private conversations that he had with me that I had for the book, he said, a lot of the Secret Service agents, he said, they're always putting Kennedy down for the women that he was with. He said, well, none of us were angels. He said, especially them, So they didn't have any right to feel that way toward President Kennedy, as far as I'm concerned, as long as he, did his job. And Kennedy was just in a set of circumstances where he probably didn't have, the greatest protection going on. There were all kinds of things swirling around him. And if I'm a great belief they set out to get the president, and they were going to get him. It happened to be in Dallas, but they tried to kill him before. And I think John Kennedy's real mistake is in thinking that he was the president of the United States.
William.
Yes.
Can I ask you, in that history, there's a DVD that I've got in the back of it, and in that DVD, you are interviewing, I think, Dennis David, Jim Jenkins, Paul O'Connor. Is it James Sybert's there as well?
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember who else.
Mm-hmm.
And you're basically showing slides of the various autopsy pictures, and you're asking the various men there to describe, did it look like the autopsy room Bethesda? And a lot of them says no, we don't remember the block on the head and the neck, we don't remember the floor tiles. Could you just talk a bit about that for the people who've not seen that?
Sure. This shoot took place in 2002. This is the book, and I included, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the book. This is the new edition. And in the back of this is the DVD that you're talking about. Now, I went in there and gathered these guys together. Mainly why I did it in Florida was because Jim Seibert was in his late 80s at the time. And I'd already interviewed him for the book. And then I thought, well, you know, maybe I should have a record of this where we could all get together and I could film this and we could talk about the autopsy pictures. And so I got the guys that were still alive and willing to come. And I took them to Florida because Jim Seibert didn't want to travel. So he said, I'm 80, I think he was like 86 or 87 at that point. So I don't want to travel. And I said, well, what if I brought everybody to you? Which is what I did. And so we got him in a room and we were only going to have him for the day. So he comes in and we do this shoot. And at some point he says, well, he calls his wife and he says, honey, you know, they're all here and I don't feel right about this. He had to cancel a dinner date that was important to his wife. So he got in trouble for that, but he stayed. And we did this one day massive shoot. I think, yeah, it was just one big long shoot. And in that, we managed to get these autopsy photographs up on the wall. And it was the first time it had ever been done. And what I thought was really fantastic and historical was that most of these guys had been together since those times, but it was the very first time, at that point, it was 39 years, that Jim Seibert had seen these guys since the assassination. So it was the first time that this Secret Service, or the FBI agent, had been in a room with these guys, that he had participated in this event. And so we put the photographs up on the wall, and we talked about the brace. Of course, Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins said they didn't have a metal head brace at Bethesda, that they used what they called a chalk block that went not under the president's head like the brace was, but the block went under the neck. So that's an inconsistency. There's an inconsistency that there is a towel under the president's head that is clean and white and no blood. Doug Horn speculates that these were a very quick set of pictures that were taken within 5 minutes, just to have a record that, you know, that they took these pictures and this was the official autopsy. I don't know about that, but, you know, it's as good an explanation as any. They talked about the fact that the phone on the wall, the phone wasn't in the morgue on that wall. It was back further behind a deep sink. And the cord on the phone is a short cord, when originally the cord was a very long cord off the phone that hung to the floor. There's inconsistency in the tile matchup. All kinds of things. We went through that. I later had some of that confirmed by a man named Bill Lynch, who was not there for the autopsy, but was supposed to be there for the autopsy, but decided that he would hand that job over to Jim and Paul, and gave him the keys and said, you're supposed to go down to the morgue and set up for the president. He said, I wanted to get the hell out of there. He said, I knew it wasn't going to be fun and I didn't want any part of it. And when we did talk to him, went to Gaithersburg and talked to him, and he said, we showed him the photographs, and he said, well, he said, this phone is wrong. He said, this phone wasn't there. And he said, that cord was long enough. He said, I used to get my feet tangled up in it. Things like that. Is there anything specific you want to know, Johnny?
Well, realistically, it's about the talk about the back of the president's head and how the wound was in the back and it was large, and Out of all the witnesses that you've spoken to about the wounds the president suffered in Dallas, sustained in Dallas, do you find that more, or like the majority of the witnesses, do you think that they corroborate the Warren Commission, or do you feel like they would tend to lend credence to the conspiracy?
All I can point to is what the witnesses have said. Brain was blown out of his head. There was go back to Bethesda. Bethesda, they said there was a hole about this big of a small orange or a large egg in this part of President Kennedy's head. By the time it reaches Bethesda, the wound to the head is some 4 times larger, encompassing not only the back but the side part of the top. You've got the so-called flap of scalp there that was macerated and torn. When you some say that you could take the scalp and perhaps stretch it, but it was wrinkled and macerated and bloody. When you look at the pictures of the back of the head that look like that's exactly what they're doing, they're kind of pulling the skin. Even if that's true, the hair is clean and washed, and the back of the head is not, the piece is not wrinkled or macerated. It's pretty clean. I only go from their testimony because I met with them personally and was able to ask them questions. For the most part, I think they corroborated the fact that there was a large hole in the back of the head. Paul O'Connor said that when the body was placed on the table and the wrapping was removed, he said the wound was so massive that you could hear a gasp go throughout the room. It's confusing because, you know, there are some things that aren't consistent with Bethesda or with Dallas, which of course leads to the speculation that something was done between Dallas and Bethesda. And I do believe that there was something done to President Kennedy's. If you want to call that surgery or you want to call that probing of the body, either one, something was done to President Kennedy's remains.
Where do you think that would have been done about?
Well, you know, there's just, I can't prove anything. I can give you my opinion, I can give you speculation, but I hate to do that. I don't know if you've read the book I did with Hugh Clark.
No.
That he said that at some point where they came in a banana helicopter 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the official ambulance got to Bethesda, and they're standing around waiting for the ambulance to show up. He said that the ambulance did arrive, and then they start to follow the ambulance, and this crush of people come out of nowhere, and the ambulance takes off. And it's in the dark, and so their commander, Commander Byrd, says, "Get into the truck." So there's a truck there, they all get into the truck, and they start following the ambulance. And it goes around, and they don't, at some point, the lights go out of the ambulance and they can't find the ambulance. He says, "It's cold, it's dark, we don't know our way around, so we're just driving, trying to bump into this, get to this ambulance." He says, "We went around 2 or 3 times." And he said, finally, on the 3rd time around, he said the ambulance was just backing up to the morgue. And he said, at some point, we should have bumped into that ambulance, but we didn't. He said, so it had to go somewhere and then come back and park. And when I asked one of the other honor guards that I did in this film shoot that we did in Chicago, he said, well, either the ambulance wasn't where it was supposed to be, or we weren't where we were supposed to be. So it could have been done during that time. I can't, I'm working on that, but so far I'm not willing to tell you that I have an opinion because I can't nail it down right now. But I'm still doing research. I'm not going to be one of these guys that go, I have proven definitively this is where it's happened. I give you the information at the point that I write and what I have. And if I get more, then you'll get more. If I find something different, I won't be afraid to say something different. I'm not married to anything. I want to give you the most up-to-date knowledge that I can get. So I hope that answers it a little bit.
Thanks, William. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, William. There is a question that David has just popped into the chat area that I just want to raise. Do you agree with Doug Horn's argument that Humes performed pre-autopsy surgery on JFK's skull to remove evidence of bullet entries, etc.?
I'll answer it like this. Every time this man was before a governmental body, he would never give a straight answer to anything. He's like a man on a hot plate. Well, yeah, we said it was here, but now I can plainly see from this that maybe it was, there's never a straight answer out of these guys. You would think, that he's a trained professional doctor. He knows anatomy. Well, yes, the face sheet says we put these marks there, but it was just an approximation. No, when you have that face sheet there, that's what the face sheet is for. I've never heard anybody else say, well, it's just an approximation. I mean, it's not exactly where, they did measurements. They had time. The reason that you have a face sheet and that you take measurements and that you have a particular area that you measure from is a standard procedure. And so when they place things on this document, it is supposed to be not an approximation. It is supposed to be to scale exactly where you said it was. There's a reason for that. And now when you get these guys, they're well, yeah, I know, but we said that, but it just doesn't pass the smell test. I am more inclined. I will just say that I believe that those good doctors knew a hell of a lot more than they were ever going to tell. Let me tell you a little story that when I met with Bill Lynch, Jim Jenkins and I worked on this book together, and it took us 3 years to do. And Bill was one of Jim's friends that he knew there and was involved in the morgue. And he is the reason that Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins were the people in the morgue, because Bill was the guy that was told, you go down to the morgue and set this thing up. And he didn't want to be there. So he gave the keys to Jim and said, look, you've been told to go to the morgue and set things up. He gave him the keys. So when we're talking to him, Bill just went and lived his life. And then when Jim looked him up and started asking him these things, we get into a room with him and I give him these photographs, and he's looking at all this stuff, and he said, well, that's not right. And when I asked him, I said, Humes and Boswell, what kind of people were they? He said, I believe that they, I'm paraphrasing because he can't remember exactly what I wrote at this point, but he said they were, they did their job to the best of their ability. And, I think they were good guys, they were just trying to do the best they could. And I said, if they were told, they were given an order by a higher up, and they were said, look, for whatever reason, national security, whatever, you're going to do this. Yes, it's illegal, but you're going to do it. What would they have said? He said, look, what people don't understand, when you're in the military, you don't ask questions. And I've heard this from every military man that I have ever interviewed that's been involved in this case. When I asked Paul O'Connor, Paul, did you offer your opinion? He said, look, I was a third-class corpsman and I didn't offer my opinion about anything. He said, I did as I was told and I kept my mouth shut. Okay. So when I said, if these doctors were told, you're going to do this, you're under orders to do it, would they? He says, yeah, they would. He said, let me put it to you another way. He said, where are they going to go? Who are they going to tell? He said, even if they want to tell somebody, who are they going to tell? Who can they tell about it? Who's going to help, who's going to help them? What are they going to get out of it? So that answered the question. They're in the military. They got their whole career on the line. They've got everything to lose. They've got families. They've got pensions coming. And you're told by your superiors, you will do this. It is a matter of national security or whatever they were told. Do you actually think that those men are going to line up with a man who is dead and laying on a table in front of you? Do you think they're going to say anything against that? That's why they didn't, when they even went before governmental bodies, even if they were innocent, which I don't believe they were. I believe they knew a hell of a lot more than they ever let out. Years later, they're asked by these governmental bodies to come forward. Well, sir, can you please tell us what happened? Give us the story. They're so far in now. They're retired. They've got pensions. They're so far in. Whether they believe that they were had later, it doesn't matter. They're so far into this thing, they can't afford to tell what they know, because it will mean their lives will be totally thrown into this chaos. They're not going to risk that. President Kennedy was dead. They did what they were told, period.
Yeah.
William,
Yes.
shouldn't President Kennedy's head not have been shaved during the autopsy? Because isn't that standard procedure?
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a lot of standard procedures that should have been done that weren't done. The chaos that was there, they used that chaos to get away with whatever they got away with. They were totally under control. There were parts where they screwed it up. That I think that they didn't intend to do the thing at Bethesda. I think that was one of the things that got away from them. That because Jackman. I'm sorry, somebody asking something?
No, just go ahead. Go ahead. It's okay.
They used the chaos in hoping, that there was going to be chaos so that nobody could keep a direct line on anything. They shut this thing down. It's like they Secret Service took the pictures. Everything was controlled. They go back to Dennis David's story of he was asked, do you have secret clearance? And he did have secret clearance, and he was taken by an agent, and he was asked to type this memo about these fragments that came from the head of President Kennedy, and they were in a little pill vial type thing. And Dennis said that there was enough for one bullet, but more than one bullet, but not two. That when he was done typing the memorandum, that the agent took everything, including the typewriter ribbon, out of the typewriter, and said, "Forget I was here." So there were all kinds of procedures that should have been done, that would have been done in a so-called normal autopsy, that did not take place with President Kennedy. It's been said that Oswald was given a first-rate autopsy, something that the President of the United States was not given.
I know you were the first person to interview Sandra Spencer out with a governmental body. For people that don't know who Sandra Spencer is, can you just briefly talk about her and your interview with her?
Sandra Spencer worked at the photo lab in Anacostia, and she was brought 4x5 negatives by James K. Fox, who was in the photographic department for the Secret Service. He brought her these 4x5 negatives, and was told, develop these negatives. She says, well, I have to look at them for color balance. He said, well, it's okay to look, but don't peruse them. Don't look closely. You can look enough to color balance, but don't look closely. So she said when she was shown a set of these photographs that were supposedly in the public domain, we've all seen them. She said that the negatives, a lot of people confuse themselves and say, well, she developed pictures. She didn't develop pictures. She developed negatives. When she was shown the photographs of President Kennedy that we have in the so-called Fox set, she said that they bore no resemblance to what she had seen. She said that the negatives that she developed showed President Kennedy in a much more relaxed state, that his hair had been cleaned and combed. She didn't see the incision because he had a sheet up to his neck, I believe. At one point, there was a picture that next to President Kennedy's head was a whole brain. And when I heard that, I was like, what? And I wanted to scream, what? But I didn't. I just kind of was calm. And, well, really, was the brain whole? And she goes, I don't think that was President Kennedy's brain, because the hole in his head wasn't big enough to be able to take the brain out. So this was a different set. Now, how these were taken, where these were taken, was it done after the body was put together? I don't know. But I absolutely believed her, because there was no guile in her voice at all. There was no attempt on her part to convince me, well, this is just kind of what she wasn't really. It was like, well, this is what happened, and this is what I saw. Maybe they were taken, if the family wanted to see something, they could, they would have these to look at. To her, there wasn't anything suspicious. It was just kind of, well, this is what I saw, and that's what I remember. So, and she said that the hole in the throat was much smaller than the gash. I think she said it was about thumbnail size, which is bigger than the pencil, but and the hole in the head was not very, in the back of the head was not big. It certainly wasn't big enough to take the brain out. And so, and of course, the whole brain next to the head was kind of a revelation. So where did that come from? Was that a little scenario that they had, but then decided that they had to discard that? And I don't know, anything else that I would tell you would be speculation on my part. I just report what those people told me, and that's what she told me.
Did you interview George Knudsen? Was it George Knudsen?
He was dead by that time. Knudsen has said that he was called before a bunch of people that night, that he took the set of autopsy photographs of President Kennedy, and that he was the only person in the room. And to quote him, he said, it was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Now, where does George Knudsen come into this? When did he take pictures? One of those things we just don't know. Don't have enough information.
Well, didn't Knudsen say that these weren't the pictures that he had taken because they had been taken by something called a press back, and he never used that style of processing photographs or something? Off the top of my head, I can't.
You may be thinking, you may be right, but you may be thinking about George Stringer.
Maybe it was Stringer.
Stringer, who was the civilian photographer, who said not only that, he said half of these photographs are of the bottom of the brain. And he said, I didn't take any bottom views of the brain. He also said that, what else did he say? I didn't take any bottom views of the brain. The paper is different and the stock is different than I would have used. So we have those anomalies.
Thanks, William. Thank you.
Sure.
William, just talking about analogies. There is a question, again, a quick follow-up question from David. And again, it's speculation, yeah? So you may not be able to answer, but the question is, could the photos of the autopsy room have been staged somewhere else, you know, and then posted at, like, example, Waxworks or something? You know, is that something that you ever thought about, or is that?
Well, absolutely, I've thought about it. You know, if you buy my book, you will get the whole story, and you will get a nice disc that says that at one point toward the end of the film that I did in 2002, and I think this is for the very first time, Paul O'Connor says, I think it was Jim, it might have been Jim, it might have been Paul, who said, you know, and they have these photographs and they're kind of looking at them. Says, you know, I don't think these photographs were taken in our morgue. And then the other one says, yeah, me too. So they actually have them on film saying that I don't think these were taken in our morgue.
Thank you very much. I mean, one thing I would just add on, the comment from David is, don't worry about your book. He will absolutely be buying your book. Don't worry. There's one. Go ahead.
I really, you know, I didn't really set out to do that, but it was like, you know, here I am, I've got this information, let's do it. How it started out for me was I got this, you know, I had become so obsessed with this case, and at the time I was in my mid-30s, and I started reading everything I could about the case. I just became so obsessed. I thought about it every day. I read about it every day, something. I thought about it every day. My poor son, who was a teenager, would have to put up with my ranting about how, you know, they killed the president and nobody cares. And I think he's like, at some point, he's like 15 years old. He is now about to turn 46. So that'll tell you how long I've been doing this. He said, one day, I'm going off on some rant about Kennedy, and he said, you know, Dad, if you care so much about this, why don't you do something about it? So I decided, you know, this is not a healthy activity. I had heard that there was, I don't remember now how I grasped that there was conferences about this thing, but I did find out that there was going to be a conference held in Dallas. I didn't know anything about the Ask conferences or anything like that, but I'd read something about something Lancer conference, and so I'm going to go to this. I am going to go to this conference, and I am going to be with like-minded people. I'm going to talk about this with them. I'm going to pick up on their ideas. I'm going to come home. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to pack up all this stuff. I'm going to stop reading about all this stuff, and I'm going to give it up. Middle-aged men should not be obsessed with this. So I did that. I went, I did the standard thing, and I stood in the plaza and I looked around. And what was really interesting, when I was in the plaza, I didn't know it at the time, but there was a person running a thing that for $25, you could take the same exact route President Kennedy had. And at the moment that he goes almost to the underpass or gets in, you know, into Dealey Plaza, there's this recording of like 3 shots that along with this car. And so like, I'm looking at the overpass and I'm walking down the thing and I'm looking at it and I'm looking at all the people and I hear boom, boom, boom. And I whip around and here's the limousine. I thought, I'm in the Twilight Zone. Here is the limousine and shots are going off. And it's like really quick. And I'm like, I don't know what the hell is going on. It's like, what the hell? And I'm like, my adrenaline is pumping so hard. Then I realize, oh, this is a reenactment. My heart is pounding out of my chest. But you know the wonderful thing about that? Like the unsuspecting people that were lining that street in 1963, I was in the same position. So I see I'm looking at the overpass. I see the limousine. I hear the shots, and I'm like, "What the hell is this?" My adrenaline is pumping, and I am literally shaking. And then it's a reenactment. So now I don't want to look like an idiot. So I start looking around at, well, did anybody notice that, I just absolutely flipped out. But the wonderful thing about that was it gave me a sense of what these people in the plaza had gone through. It was a real gift to have that, to go, oh my God, to see this thing momentarily. You could be wrong about things if you're in the plaza, you see this 6 seconds or 9 seconds or whatever it was. But talking to men that had the president's body, they had it for an extended period of time. They were trained professionals or training to be professionals. They knew about anatomy. They had done autopsies before. And here they have the president's body for hours. And surely if there were answers to be had, they would have them. And that, to tell you how I left this thing alone, I went home and I forgot about it. 3 months after I came out of Dealey Plaza, I found myself sitting in Gerald Custer's living room, interviewing him about his experiences. So it lit the fire even brighter than it had before. So I go from that conference intending to forget about it, never talk about it again, never think about it again, get over the obsession, to sitting in Gerald Custer's living room, who of course had taken the x-rays of President Kennedy's body. And that led from one to the other, to the other, to the other, to where I'm here today, 3 books down the road, and 15 years of my life invested in one on Bobby Kennedy. So it's been a journey, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.
William, thank you so much. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Johnny.
I just want to ask William a question. I ask this to every kind of author that I've spoke to, or people that are really interested in this case. So I want to ask William the same question. I'm going to ask you to speculate for a moment. I know you don't like to do it, but I'm going to ask you anyway. According to Lee Bowers, there was 2 men behind the picket fence during the assassination of the president. Can you think of any innocent explanation why these men haven't came forward in 58 years and said, well, I was behind the fence and I seen nobody?
Well, I do believe that activity is highly suspicious. And I believe they're probably no longer alive, but if they wanted to stay alive, they weren't going to come forward. As you know, I don't know when you were born, but in the 1970s, which I was there for, there were a lot of witnesses that died. It was not a healthy time for people that knew things about the assassination, So I believe that, if they were in any way involved, I'm hoping, even all these years later, that there are people that are still clinging to life, that will leave some sort of record, that will come forward, and we'll have those answers. I'm not very hopeful, but you never know. Stranger things have happened. To answer your question straight out, no, I cannot think of an innocent answer to that. And I do believe that's what Lee Bowers saw. And of course, he died under somewhat bizarre circumstances. Who knows? The mystery continues. I have other things that I haven't shared here today that I have done recently that I know that you will want to hear about. And when I've written about it and got it down on paper, then I'll come back and we can talk about it. I'll tell you that it's pretty exciting.
William, please do, because today's been wonderful. It's been a terrific day, and thank you so much for sharing your video with us. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
It was a
Well, you can blame Bart for that one. It's like, I don't know how I managed to let him talk. Oh, come on, William. Just, why are you keeping that to yourself? Just share it with us. I think I've shared more with your group than I have the groups over here. He's like, well, while you're in Dallas, could you just, kind of keep a running diary of what you're doing, and maybe we'll publish that. And hey, while you're interviewing Jim Lavelle, do you think you could film that? And would you send it to me? And I wind up doing it. I'm just his puppet. So
yeah, basically he bullied you into it. Well done, Bart. Thank you very much. William, thank you so much. It's been a wonder to meet you. Seriously, thank you so much. And I think a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us, William.
Thank you, guys.
And please come back and talk to us again. We'd love to meet you again. And if ever in London, let us know. Come over and join us.
I had a standing invitation to come to the UK. My very best friend was Matthew Smith, the noted writer.
Wonderful.
We did some projects together. We did a book on Marilyn Monroe together. Matthew passed before the book was all the way finished. I hope to have that published at some point. But he said, you need to don't wait too long. And as usual, I waited too long, and he was almost 90, or was 90 when he passed. And it's the only experience I've had with a person that was more than old enough to be my father, where there was absolutely no age difference whatsoever. We were kindred spirits, and he had a interest in anything Kennedy, and so did I. And we just meshed from the very first time we met. And so I've always wanted to come to your part of the world for a very long time, for 50 years.
Please do.
I plan to, as soon as this pandemic thing is over, I hope to get over there. So
let us know if you do. We'll organize an event. Let us know if you do.
I'd love it. You got anything else you want before we shuffle off?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Great. Thanks a million. Well, I'm just going to stop the recording, but if people want to stay on and chat, they're more than welcome to do that. But William, on behalf of all of us at DP UK, we really appreciate you meeting you. Wonderful man. And thank you so much for sharing your video with us and your research with us and answering all of our questions. We very much appreciate it. And big thumbs up all around.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.